One of the many strange things about the world we live in today is that we tend to think about politics as if everything we love and hold dear depends on the outcome of the next election. Every time an election comes up, it is presented as the most important election of our lives, as make or break, now or never, only for us to completely forget about that once the election is over, and then to repeat the same routine when the next election comes up. Now in South Africa, there's an election coming up next year, and there's already great speculation, fear and excitement about what the outcome of that election would be. The point of this video is not to say that elections are not important, but that elections are certainly not the beginning and the end of political life, and it certainly isn't the most important thing we ought to think of when we think about how we structure our political lives. One of the reasons why we think this way is because to our minds the word politics is inextricably linked to elections, when politics is in fact a much broader term. When Aristotle said several hundred years before Christ already that man is a political animal, he did not mean that it's in our nature to get excited about voting for some political party every once in a while. With this famous line, Aristotle was conveying a universal truth, which is that it is in our nature to have a particular affinity for our own communities and culture, and that we want to see that these things that we inherited will be preserved. That is politics in the bigger scheme of things, not merely voting for a political party. So even though political parties and elections are important, one of the major destructive consequences about this narrow way of thinking about politics is that we are not inclined to sit back and think about what the actual problem is. This is because the entire concept of an election is to sit down at a table that has already been set in a particular way. And sometimes when we get annoyed about politics and the bigger scheme of things, we would do well to consider for a moment if the problem is how we sit at this table, or whether the table is not properly set in the first place. In other words, we would do well to consider if our problem is perhaps not the party that is elected to govern the country, but the system within which the parties are elected. The South African Constitution was adopted in 1996, and at the time it was widely proclaimed as a miracle. It was even presented as the final constitution, disregarding the fact that it's perfectly normal and natural and predictable for constitutions to change over time. In fact, the law school at the University of Chicago did a study on this and found that the average constitution lasts for about 17 years, while the average constitution in Africa lasts for about 12.4 years, before of course it is replaced with something new. And perhaps we shouldn't blame the commentators of the 90s so much for presenting the South African Constitution as the final constitution, because that was indeed the zeitgeist at the time. Francis Fukuyama, as we know, famously said that the fall of the Berlin Wall constitutes the end of history, that mankind has probably reached its final stage of human development, and that the world would standardize on liberal democracy. So the expectation at the time was indeed that there would not be significant political changes in the future, and that the world would pretty much remain the same, or as Fukuyama said, would probably be quite boring. Now 30 years down the line, we do know that this is not how things played out, that we have not reached the end of history, and that there are indeed significant changes that lie ahead for us. We can and should be very concerned about these changes, but there is also reason to be optimistic about what lies ahead, because, and that is the point of this video, to underline that we have more control over these constitutional changes than we tend to think. Let me explain why. In his book, There Is No Supreme Constitution, Koos Malan explains that there is a difference between a constitution with a capital C and a constitution with a small c. We tend to think of constitutions as a written document. A document that explains what the political system looks like and how the country ought to be governed. The constitution with a small c is how things are in reality. And what we often find, especially in modern political systems, is that there is a major difference between the constitution with a capital C, in other words, the written text of the constitution, and the constitution with a small c, in other words, how things materialize on ground level. Think about it this way. If two Martians were to visit South Africa, one was to spend an entire week in his spaceship reading and studying the South African Constitution, and the other one was to spend an entire week in South Africa in local communities. If these two aliens were to report back on what South Africa looks like, the one that studied the Constitution and the one that experienced reality would give two irreconcilable reports about what South Africa is. This is because the actual or the de facto constitution differs very much from the written or the de jure constitution. And when we think about constitutional change, we think about the Parliament or the Council of Provinces meeting and then voting about the text of the written constitution and how it ought to be changed. But in South Africa, the most important constitutional changes that are already happening are the constitutional changes in the actual constitution. Or, to put it differently, the way in which we ought to think about constitutionalism is not in the first place what the text prescribes, but what is happening in real life. And for this reason, the constitution has changed dramatically since the 1990s. And there are many examples of this. Recently, President Cyril Ramaphosa, for example, repeated comments made earlier by a former National Police Commissioner stating that the South African government and the South African Police Service in particular are not able to fulfill their constitutional mandate to keep the people of this country safe. So while the de jure constitution says to us that the government will keep us safe, the de facto constitution makes it clear that the South African government is pretty much absent. And in this void, something remarkable is happening, which is that local communities that are well organized are filling the void by simply taking control of the things that are important to them. So where the South African government and the police, for example, are not doing their jobs, well-organized local communities are simply taking ownership and doing it themselves. When the government does not fix potholes as they are supposed to, we can fix those potholes ourselves. When schools and universities are failing, we can build our own schools and universities. When government-run media institutions are failing, we can build our own media institutions, and so forth. Even though the media in South Africa is inundated with bad news, and even though there is much to be concerned about, we would do well to stop and think for a moment about the progress we have made in the last few years. And I'm particularly referring to the void where the South African government ought to be that is being filled by local communities. If the South African government had its way, they would certainly control every aspect and every sphere of society. But they aren't able to do this, partly because of corruption, partly because of incompetence. And we can discuss many more variables contributing to this. But the fact of the matter is that the South African government is not able to do the things they would like to do. And guess what? That's good news. It's good news because local communities can step up and do these things themselves. Yes, we do pay tax, and yes, we expect of the South African government to do these things. And certainly taxes and the extent to which we pay taxes will become an increasingly hot topic in South Africa, especially as people start to reach consensus that they are paying taxes for services that they are not receiving. But for now, the important thing we ought to be discussing and focusing on is how do we fill this void that is being created by the South African government. Now, in the weeks and months to follow, I will do some more videos about federalism, about self-governance, about how the South African constitution is changing, and so forth. But for now, allow me to make one or two quick comments before we conclude this video. South Africa is a very big country. It's virtually the size of Europe without Spain. Not only is South Africa a big country, it's a very diverse country with a plethora of different cultures, languages, and so forth. But despite this reality, we have a political system that is very much centralized, with a government that would very much like to control every aspect of society. In other words, we have a political system that is detached from reality. And as I said, this political system is changing already. In some ways for the worse, but in some very important ways, it's changing for the better. One of the ways in which the constitution is changing, often for the worse, is simply the way it is being interpreted. The same text can be interpreted in different ways, and courts within a political system can over time change the way in which they interpret the text. The best or easiest example is to refer to section 25 of the constitution that says that the government can expropriate private property when it is in the public interest. Now we can discuss what that actually means. My opinion of what constitutes public interest would certainly differ significantly from many people who are supposed to represent us in the South African Parliament. But interpretations of the text is not the most important way in which a constitution is changing. The de facto realities on ground level carries much more weight. And herein lies an important error that we tend to make. We tend to think that a society is structured according to the laws of the time. The truth is the other way around, which is that the laws of the time are much rather structured according to the realities on ground level. And when there is a gap or a discrepancy between what the Constitution with a capital C says or dictates and what the reality on ground level tells us, the tendency is not for reality to change to fulfill the instructions it is given by law, but rather for law to change, to adapt to changing circumstances. Now, this is not to say that we shouldn't be concerned about some left-wing takeover of parliament, of a more radical or a more unstable government. These things are indeed issues that we should be concerned about. But when we are concerned about these things, we ought to remember that the most important thing that we can do is not to hope that we would have a responsible government, but to fill the void that is already left behind by an inefficient, incompetent government through community involvement and community institutions simply taking control and ownership of the things that are important to us.